everything spent on NASA benefits humanity, whether it's education, whether it's inspiring people to dream big and giving them access to things that they might not have access to, books, internet, right? When you can inspire young people and older people or any people to dream big and solve problems in their community, then every single penny we spend at NASA is worth it.
My guest today is the legendary Renee Wynn. She's a longtime public servant, having spent over 20 years at the EPA before taking the reins as Chief Information Officer for NASA in 2015. And she led NASA through some of its largest digital transformations.
For us to be a safety-driven culture, we had to be a cyber-driven culture. We still needed to make missions happen. We still needed to turn science fiction into fact for the benefit of humanity. But we needed to have safety and cybersecurity as part of that whole issue.
She serves on advisory boards for multiple organizations and has an impressive resume. But I was most impressed with how very down-to-earth she is, forgive the pun, and how genuine and real she is.
The most important thing to you when you're in charge of an organization is your people. If you take care of them, they will take care of the work.
Now, this was my first time meeting Renee, and we had this wide-ranging conversation of nearly 2 hours, and it went by all too fast. I had such a good time talking with her. I learned so much from her. I think you all will too. And now, here's Renee Wynn. Hello, Renee.
Hi there, Andy. How are you?
I'm fantastic. I'm excited to have you here.
Oh, it's great to be here. Like the NASA shirt.
I had to be topical. I'm a big fan of NASA.
Mm-hmm.
There's all kinds of stuff. I think we could spend the next day talking about your NASA experience, but there's plenty to discuss.
There is.
Your resume is sort of hard to box in any one way. So I'm always curious, how would you describe yourself? If you're saying, hey, I'm Renee, this is what I do, or this is who I am.
I always start with I'm a mom and a wife first and foremost, because that's the person I always am, right? That's the hat that you always have, right? You get a text to answer, or obviously I live with my husband, and so he's around quite a bit. I'm an aunt. I have 2 fabulous nieces. I have 2 step nephews as well. I'm not as close with them, but I've gotten to know them recently a little bit better. And then my father is still living, so I guess I'm a daughter, and I'm a sister-in-law because my husband has a brother. So, every title a female can have, I probably carry, although I don't have grandmother yet, and I would love to have that someday.
No pressure. No pressure, kids.
Yeah, I know. No pressure.
So I think that's a pretty impressive start and tells me a lot about you from the jump. Mm-hmm. Because, again, you have an impressive resume. You could come out swinging. You're like, well, I did this and I do this and I'm over here and over here, because you are doing all that. But that's very grounding. And I appreciate that, because I'm the same way. Sometimes, like, I recently started using the title CEO at my company, and I hate it. Mm-hmm. It feels very uppity. I try to keep myself pretty humble. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, hey, I'm a father. I'm a husband. A lot of times I'm like, I'm a paramedic, which isn't what I get paid to do. It's my passion sort of project. And then eventually I'm like, and I run an IT cybersecurity company. But that's not who I am.
Yeah.
That's who I am.
This identity is a really interesting element of any conversation. Because when I got ready to retire, I had to adjust to the lack of comma title. And especially being the Chief Information Officer for NASA.
Especially if you held such title too.
Exactly. And so when I made the decision to retire, the mental model that I had to build for myself was that lack of affinity. Right? When you tell people you're from NASA, I don't know how many times I've had my picture taken in airports or out on the streets. Usually when I would travel, I always carried a bunch of NASA stickers and coloring books and things like that. And I would give them out to people. And that way I could advertise and help people dream. Right? And imagine, envision. Right?
I'm glad you recognize that's a big role of NASA.
Oh, absolutely. My former boss, the amazing Charlie Bolden, he said NASA's budget, which was about 23 billion at the time he was there, he says, oh, that's 23 billion for education.
Yeah.
Every year. And it's true because we turn science fiction into fact. But this introduction piece is an interesting one without really having a company or anything like that. But part of when I was preparing to retire was getting rid of that comma identification. And, it was really easy to let go of that. Although for speeches and things like that, I do use my title of former CIO of NASA because it cuts through all of this eyeing you up stuff, sizing you up, right? I punch above my weight, but it allows people to connect with me because usually we start telling stories or answering questions about NASA. And affinity also helps with other ways of connecting, not just how you identify, but people then can ask you questions about your experiences. And then you can get to the really fun stuff like how do you spend your personal time? What did you dream of as a kid? And are you even close to that now?
Man, you're asking the questions that I'm going to ask you.
I know. Sorry about that.
We're going to get into all
But that's where affinity, can help. That comma title piece can help with that connection. But for the most part nowadays, as kind of someone in a portfolio part of my career, I think I identify more with my titles within my family than anything else.
I love that. Mm-hmm. So, and today you're involved, from what I understand, you're involved in all kinds of things. You're in board positions. I know you're a public speaker, a TED Talk, I think. Yes,
I do have a TED Talk about cybersecurity in space as well as debris in space, two very large emerging threats.
Yes. Okay. We're going to have so much fun. I don't know if we have enough time for all the things I want to cover.
Well, let's get rocking.
So let's go back. Mm-hmm. Crazy resume, impressive, all this. And now all the titles you just gave me starts with, of course, a young Renee. Mm-hmm. And young Renee, as you mentioned, had some hopes and dreams and whatnot. Tell me about young Renee.
Young Renee wanted to be rich.
I love it. Okay, good.
Young Renee didn't want to be a public servant.
Okay.
And young Renee wanted to be a lawyer. And each element has a little different story. So I'll run through them quickly. Yeah. I wanted to be rich because when my parents got divorced, it was a time when my mom had a credit card and she lost that credit card in the divorce. Yeah. And she couldn't get a new one unless her husband or her father signed for it.
It's crazy how recent that is.
It is. It is in my lifetime. And I was struck by this because I was 13, 14 at the time when this was going on. And I'm thinking, she worked for the United States government. She had, if it's really a financial decision, you would look at her financial records and go, no problem. Here's your credit card. Let's give you 6 more. But no, she was a female without a husband and a person who refused to have her father sign for her. Because why should he have to? She's an adult. She could vote. She was also covert operations for the United States government. So she could go spy on other countries, lead covert ops in other countries, and yet she couldn't get a credit card without a signature on that. So I was really struck by that. I'm like, all money, I want a lot of it, and it's going to be mine. I've settled a little bit on that one, but it's what sort of drives you forward. Sure. As for a public servant, my parents had great jobs. I'll talk, my mom, I told you already, was covert operations for the National Security Agency for the former Soviet Union. And she spoke fluent Bulgarian because that's where she did a covert operations. I didn't know that until she died because when was the last time you went to a Bulgarian restaurant and the person next to you could read the menu?
I don't think that's ever happened to me.
Me neither. So it was here when I learned it. And my stepfather was also covert ops. He was SIGINT in the Army for a long time and then switched over to NSA when he retired. So in my house, you listened for clicks. You were taught how to drive in case your arm was broken and you were going to be kidnapped. I didn't know others weren't taught this until much later in life. I was like, you didn't get taught that, right? And then, and they had great careers. And my father, who worked for NASA, Goddard Space Flight Center, and he's a metallurgist. No clue what that was until I got to NASA. So for a very long time, I'm like, I don't know what a doctor of metal does, right? And you just kind of let it go because it just wasn't cool. Parents being spies, that's a little cooler.
That is pretty cool.
And it's a little easier to talk about on the playground.
Definitely.
Right? So you go forward with all of this. And while they had great jobs, again, if I'm driven by money, I didn't see us. We were very comfortable, by goodness gracious. I have no complaints about the life that I led in terms of financial things, only what I saw women happening to women. And that really did shape me. But so then I shift over and I go off to school, and or actually, let me go over the lawyer thing. And so I was pursuing going to law school, and my mom died in the middle of taking the LSATs, and I didn't do very well in the LSATs. I just tried to just give it a try. And I just said, maybe one, I needed to go through the grieving process and stop pushing through that. She was very young. She was 48 when she died. Oh, wow. And I said, so let me just pause, put this dream on hold, and let's just see where the world takes me. Because you can't push through things if it's just really mired down. Not hard. We do hard things well.
Sure.
But you just get mired down emotionally in things. You're like, all right, let's just put it aside and see where we can go from there. So I let that dream go and ended up working for a consulting firm that worked for EPA. And within my first 2 weeks on the job working down at EPA, I fell in love with the mission. And that's when I decided that I needed to work with my heart and not for my pocketbook. And I loved every minute of it ever since.
I love that. We had a guest on fairly recently on the podcast, and we spent a lot of time talking about mission orientation for what people want to do. And that there's so much cynicism that a lot of people don't believe there are genuine people who are not motivated purely by money. Of course, we need money to survive and all that, but there are people who care so much about the mission, they're willing to do whatever it takes.
Yeah.
And they'll put themselves entirely into that. I love that. And there's a lot of my own story, a lot around my medicine work, but also my cybersecurity work, where I don't lose sight of the mission that we're in support of. And that's largely what motivates me. There is a lot similarly to you, like there's in me a desire for independence. And that's largely why I'm an entrepreneur. It's because I got tired of being on other people's thumb. And, I always have very strong vision, for better or worse, and would get frustrated, to bits if I couldn't sort of focus on my vision. But yeah, I love that grounding in that orientation. Tell me about why a lawyer? Why was that a dream to begin with?
Because all the lawyers I knew were wealthy.
Okay, so it ties back to goal number one.
Exactly.
It's a way to achieve goal number one.
Exactly. But, I'm not very good at reading comprehension, and I hate writing, beyond a grocery list and a bulleted list. Yeah. Nobody told me that those were the requirements, even though I did an internship for a judge in a district court, and I did an internship at a law office, and I did the research for the lawyers, and I would just write up my notes and give it to them, and they loved what I did. I didn't realize they were converting my notes into these big, long things and all of that. So in many ways, I think having really struggled with the LSATs, not preparing for them, I was doing pretty well in the practice test, but really kind of struggled in the middle of that test. I was 2 weeks off my mom's death. Couldn't concentrate.
No,
really couldn't concentrate. I didn't realize that was an issue. And so it just sort of, you pivot, right? You go different places. I mean, you're an entrepreneur. If you've decided to take a big risk, I always had a parachute, right? Because, I had my government. I was always going to get paid. As long as I wasn't a criminal, I would probably pretty much stay in my role. I might not advance, although I'm pretty ambitious in terms of that and would do that, but I wasn't willing to take that risk, of not having a salary.
Sure.
Yeah, because it's a big difference.
Yeah,
it is a big difference.
It has its moments where it's kind of terrifying, and still today, like we're 4 or 5 years in, and we're growing, we're successful, but I always have it eating at the back of my mind.
Yeah,
like it could all go away. So I'm constantly sort of reassessing, as unrealistic and hopefully unrealistic as that is. It does always sort of eat at me. I want to ask about you're sort of looking back at what happened. Your mother passed. In the time you were testing for the LSAT, didn't do so great. Did you know it at the time? Like, did you know I have to put this on the shelf? I need to deal with the grief, or were you just kind of caught up in the moment? And that's just sort of how to play it out.
I think it was a wake-up call. I think we all get wake-up calls. It's whether we pay attention to them or not, right? How many times you need to be hit in the head with a hammer before you realize you probably ought to stop because that hurts. And I think what had happened is I sat in on the test, and the self-talk probably wasn't the best either. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not prepared. but I had this dream, I'm going to go through it. I can prove that I can do anything regardless of the circumstances. So maybe just a little too much ego in that one. And when the scores came back, I was like, God, that was awful. And then I reflected on it and I said, I'm just going to pause. I had only been married a few months at this point. And so I said, okay, this door is not closed yet, but let's just put a pause on that one and, just do the things that are in front of you. Be good at your job, help your boss be successful. Everything that's important to your boss, you should be wildly into. You should be passionately into, because helping your boss be successful is a sign of a good employee. And so I fortunately have had some great bosses along the way. And my one boss at this particular time, right? And it was easy to focus on work and focus on my marriage and just kind of see where life was going to actually take me. I could go back if I needed to, or I could go forward. And so forward I went, and it turned out pretty well.
Yeah, there's something about that sort of narrowing your focus to what's immediately in front of you when you have big things like that going on around you, like death of a parent, which thankfully I haven't experienced. But when you have that sort of heavy stuff around the tactical of like, let me just get through this, let me work this little bit of progress here and just let that all be. I think that's a good mechanism.
It is, because it allows you to move through the grief. Grief hits everybody in very different ways.
Oh, yeah.
It really does. And so you ride the tide, right? And you just get through it. And death is different, I think, depending upon the stage of life. I think depending upon the relationship to the individual and that. And so, just pause and let grief happen. And there'll be days that are awesome. And there are days that are like, oh my gosh, I don't really want to get up right now, but I need to, because one foot in front of the other is an okay way to spend the time. So you do that. And I've, talked to a lot of people about grief, especially if they worked for me. I would always come up to them and I'm like, listen, you're going to have good days and you're going to have bad days. And you just need to send a signal to me or to your boss. Because at this point, I've probably had people in between me and some other people. And I said, but let the process play itself out. Don't try to push yourself through it, because it'll show up in really ugly ways if you do. Yeah. So, and they did. So I think in many ways it helped me to be more empathetic. I was
going to say, it screams empathy.
It does. And it allowed me to do that, because I've never really won for that before then. I was like, nope, you've got a job to do. You're going to do a job. Like, I would have been a great soldier. Go take that hill. You got it. We're taking that hill. Right. But your success is the accumulation of the people around you. And you are always part of a team. You're always connected with somebody. Right. And so all of a sudden you sort of have this wake up like, oh, I am part of a community. And I guess you can't really take people out all the time. I played soccer for years. And so, it kind of felt good sometimes on a field where you would just throw an elbow, or maybe your feet were in a little bit of a different spot, or you'd hold the back of the shorts a little bit.
Get away with a little something.
You get away with a little something and take out your aggression, not in a way where anybody would be injured. I was only yellow carded once in playing over 20 years. So that just tells, right. It doesn't mean
I spent a fair amount of time in penalty boxes and hockey and lacrosse and different things. So.
You see, so
maybe a little less control of my aggression, but it's under control now.
Well, I think there might have been a little bit of a presumption that maybe females couldn't be all that aggressive, but you know what? We'd come back pretty battered and bruised and all of that. So, learning how to manage yourself, how to manage your emotions, and how to be an empathetic leader. And if you aren't that naturally, you probably have to work at it, like I have to. I really do.
Well, and I think that's a very important point. Talking about leadership, I struggled for a long time. I still regularly sort of struggle in my role as a leader to remember that it's a skill set. Mm-hmm. A lot of people are really good at making it look natural. And it can be very frustrating when you're like, I'm not that guy. You have to remember there are people like yourself who have achieved so much and been leaders at the highest level. To hear you say, I have to work at it. Mm-hmm. That's important for people to recognize. It doesn't have to be perfectly natural 100% of the time.
Absolutely. I have a story, and some have probably already heard this. This will just give you a sense of where I needed to go with my emotional intelligence with others. And that was my boss, a dear friend, walked into my office and he handed me, this is back when computers were just entering into the office, hands me a pamphlet and it says Conflict Management for Women. And my look probably said it all, but at this point I knew inside voice versus outside voice. So I look at it and I stare him down, a look of, what in the world are you giving me? This, I can handle conflict. That's my look. That's not what I said. And I said, well, thanks for thinking of me. Expression was different than words. He knows me well enough. And he says, pick a date. Best training I ever went to at this point. Because one, conflict management is about managing your emotions.
Yeah.
And what's your point? What do you want to get out of this? And you really ought to strive for win-win. Because there really is something everybody can get out of it. Now, are they willing to live by that is a different issue, but you can get to those negotiations. And so I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. And then I, at this class, I won a couple of contests. Well, competitive, right? So big prize. And so I got to pick some things. So I picked tapes because whenever I commuted, this is before podcasts and everything else, I always had either languages running or books running or learning things running or just classical music. At the end of the day, I always just listened to classical music. So I just needed my brain to go. But in the morning, when I had control over how I was spending my time, which is only on my commute, then I would listen to these things. And it was about being an executive because I'd always dreamed, okay, if I'm in the government, I'm going to be at the highest I could ever be. So how do I do that? Well, I watch. Yes, I love that. Not so much on that one. Make a note of that one. Don't treat people like this. And so I went to this class and it was fabulous. And I can tell you why I say it's so fabulous. My husband went to Virginia Military Institute.
Okay.
All men at the time he went. Well, I pay state taxes in Virginia. And BMI is a state school. And at this time, women couldn't go when we had this conversation. And this was an off-limits conversation. Relationships probably have them. You might not willingly admit it, but There are those conversations. And we didn't have it because I'm a believer, if military has a requirement to do a job, it shouldn't be gender-based. It should be a job. If it's physically, if it's physically, you have to carry a 150-pound pack up a hill. That's not a gender thing. That's a capability point, right? And if that's the requirement, that's the requirement. Great. So I didn't know why I couldn't go to that school. And I was paying state taxes. Wasn't if the women's state taxes in Virginia didn't go to that school. So I said, then go private, right? You get to make your own rules of private. And so I'd gone to my class and I could do conflict management and negotiations. Yep, one class makes you dangerous. We had a fabulous conversation. One, because it wasn't an emotional conversation.
Sure.
First, seek to learn. So why are you concerned about women coming into BMI? And it wasn't women per se. It was the way the school might treat women coming in to the organization, and not treat as in discrimination, but what are they going to do to the standards, right? If I'm in the middle of a fight, a battle, unfortunately, there are way too many of them around the globe right now. Yeah. I need to trust the people next to me. I'm like, I totally agree with that, right? So the standards should be the standards, and they keep the standards, but it needs to be equal. Separate is not equal because you don't have the same network. And network is where you go after a while in any job and in your personal life. And so I said, separate isn't going to work because I'm not going to be talking to the commandant of VMI and the general who comes in to speak to them. I'm going to be over here doing the girls thing. I said, so I want to be in the room in order to meet the people that can help me be the best version of myself. And so we came to we were like, okay, we were actually very much aligned, just a different viewpoint. But because I could emotionally take myself out of the discussion, we had a really good conversation about VMI and women in that. And, hence women are there. And, their women's soccer team is kind of cleaning up. So it's pretty good for their sports program that they've got women there.
That's not at all where I thought this was going. When you talk about the handout that was given to you, it sounded so misogynistic, just the way it's titled, Conflict Resolution for Women, as if it's here's your version.
Yeah. That's funny. Somebody else said that to me and I went, one, I adored my boss. I never once, his heart was in what he was giving me. And this was also the time where they separate him. And I actually think there are times when you're having conversations that conflict management, the way women communicate and the way men, and this is a generalization, which makes things a really crazy place to go, right? Women don't communicate for hierarchy. Men do. Where am I in the pack? Right? There was the Defending the Caveman, a comedy years ago. I have never laughed so hard at something. And my husband and I are just sitting there pointing at each other the whole time.
There's a lot of truth in it.
Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah. And whereas women are always aligned. And so when you communicate as a female and somebody perceives you as putting yourself above the pack, that's a signal. That's not a good signal. If they put themselves below the pack, the women are like, no, don't say that about yourself. You're fabulous. You go above the pack.
That's an interesting.
Right. Yeah. So when you have these communication dynamics that are different, sometimes having a class that's separate is good. But this was also back in the 90s when training programs were still trying to figure out how do we have all these women in the workforce and have training for them to give them the tools to be the best versions of themselves, to lead large, complex organizations. They've got to go to school. They've got to go to these classes. And that was the first answer. Turned out it was great, right? I didn't even look at it that way because he had his heart in the whole thing. He didn't design the class. He just read the pamphlet and said, given your sharp edges and your sharp elbows, this is something you need to go to. And it was one of the best trainings I've ever been to.
It sounds like from the get-go, the whole story, Renee so far, driven, shines through. Driven, passionate, sounds like unafraid.
Yeah.
Where's that come from?
I think it's natural, but I don't know. If you tell me I can't do something, out the door I was. I mean, my mom said I was the hardest kid to ever raise. And I looked at her, I'm like, I didn't hurt any children, right? But, I would stand up in class. Apparently I would stand up in class. I don't know. I was just told that my French teacher was teaching French. And apparently I felt like I could probably do better at that. I was in second grade. Apparently my parents got a phone call about this.
Brimming with confidence. I love it.
Maybe a little too much, sure. Right? So I don't have maybe enough breaks on what I would do and what I didn't do. But part of that is I consider myself much more of a kinetic learner. So I would end up in some pretty sticky situations and boy, I would learn. I would really learn from those. And that's also how you use your words, learning to use the right words and build people up and have constructive, difficult conversations in a way that your message is well received. That's all an art that you have to learn along the way. And some people have it naturally because maybe that's what happens in the house. Maybe not. It's not to say that's the only place you learn things, but out on the playground, right? I would stick up for the kids that were being bullied. And then of course I would get, in trouble for maybe pushing a bully down or two. But I was willing to, okay, fine. So I'm punished because I knew that what I did was wrong, right? You don't push someone in the ground they might get hurt on the playground, but I also felt confident that I chose the right path. I chose the right path to defend somebody, maybe not the right tool to do that. And so, yes, I've been pretty strong-willed from the beginning.
Yeah. Well, you said, in the beginning, you didn't think you would be a public servant. Like that wasn't really a drive, but that's all the makings of what we want in public servants.
I guess, the way I looked at it is I didn't see women in roles I didn't see women leaders in a lot of roles when I was growing up. Right. And what I did see about the women in government, my mom sued and won a class action suit against the United States government about women actually being in covert operations. And so that's what I saw in the government. Right. And then my dad was an engineer, and there certainly were no female engineers around him. So I figured to be a female and to be in charge, I had to go private sector.
To me, it feels like such a different world. I know it's so recent, but it almost sounds absurd. Like, again, going back to the pamphlet, the idea that something like that was titled and handed out just sounds like, what? That's something out of so long ago, but I guess it wasn't really that long ago.
No, yeah. So there's a boatload of us that, leading organizations that had a different paradigm, just like every generation that walks in has a different paradigm, right? My niece just graduated from college. She had no high school graduation. Well, she did. It was in my living room because everybody kind of moved into my house, and we had
during COVID.
This was during COVID, right? She graduated. Now she graduated, and so she had her first ever, graduation, the pomp and circumstance, and all of that. So we look at this generation and how it's been shaped by public policy decisions, by geopolitical issues, climate change, you name it. Every era gets shaped by them, and you just go with it, right? You don't, frankly, I'm not big on being a victim. And there's a great...
I can't imagine that.
No. And I don't think I think it's hard. People get circumstances that are really bad and tragic and awful. And there's a woman who writes, Dr. Edith Eger, I think I'm saying her name right, and she was in concentration camps. And she talks about this victim, and you need to lose the victim, the lens by which you see life through as a victim, and grow from that. And I'm telling you, if somebody who rode on a train to Auschwitz to protect the train. She was on the top because the Nazis decided that laying children on top of a train would prevent the Allies from bombing that train. One, the thought process is just, can't go there.
Yeah.
And to do that, and then she's written several books, and she's got a class on losing being a victim. And she's worked with a lot of military folks and I read her stuff and I go back over it a lot, because when I'm feeling sorry for myself, I'm like, really?
Right.
Really?
It's like if anyone's entitled to be a victim.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And she talks about her growth out of that. She was embarrassed about being in a concentration camp. And you just... Tragic. But it's my view through all of this, right? It's all of ours we have a lens of our history that we've lived through, our personal histories, and you just make decisions along the way, and you can make those decisions. And so all of this is life's really about continuous learning, right? For me, I had to slow down, right? As one of my former bosses say, just run till you're apprehended. Well, when I was a kid, I was apprehended so many times, not by the actual cops, just so you know, but I was apprehended so many times that those were my lessons along the way. Others learn a little bit easier. They look at somebody else's mistake. In my house, we call this the cheap mistake. Somebody gives you advice on how not to make a particular mistake, and you follow it.
There's so many different paths I want to go down here. One, I was going to ask, do you consider yourself a lifelong learner? I feel like I have that question answered.
Absolutely.
Right. It seems like nonstop, which I love. And I'm the same way. Whether it's a character flaw or whatever, like I'm constantly trying to get new information. It's a problem. And someone summed this up recently. It's like every night when you lay down, you have the choice between all the knowledge of human history and everything right there, or you could look at the back of your eyelids. And I'm terrible about staying up till 4 a.m., just flipping through Wikipedia or whatever.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, for whatever reason, I wanted to look that up.
Yeah.
But I can't help it.
Well, now I know why you're in the is a paramedic or EMT? You want to use
I'm a paramedic.
Paramedic. Okay. Yeah. And I'm sure there are differences, and I apologize. I don't know
it's
that.
All good.
But you imagine how that has changed over time in your time in doing that, and that the knowledge that it takes to be an emergency response and the differences that you're seeing, especially now that we're more cognizant of somebody having a mental challenge, and that could become a medical thing too, and you're having to be there. If you don't learn new techniques or keep those techniques at the forefront, your effectiveness is based on your learning and your ability to turn that knowledge into action, which is so incredible. And thank you for doing that. I can never do that because I need my 8 to 9 hours of sleep.
Yeah, no, it can be disruptive, but it is one of the things paramedicine as a profession does a really good job of, frankly, forcing you to constantly update your training. I mean, you're in a constant cycle of recertifying and everything. I'm a big proponent of cybersecurity, the world I'm in, of learning from that field.
Yeah.
Because it is always changing. It is kind of funny. Medicine's a circle. I've been doing it 15 years. There were medicines when I first learned, everyone was like, oh, these are terrible. They don't work. And then like 5 years later, like, ooh, this works really well. And now I need you to learn it because we're going to do it all the time. And then 5 years later, like, ooh, we're taking that back because it's not good. We found out it's bad. Yeah. So it's just like this constant cycle where, okay, this works. It doesn't work. I do this. I use this technique. I don't. Kind of always have to be ready for, whatever. But yeah, it's very similar to what I do in cybersecurity, where it's every day is a different thing. We have all these emerging threats, these emerging challenges, AI and all this stuff where we're kind of just having to operate in the dark here and figure it out.
It is. And cybersecurity has been interesting. So I sort of fell into it. I was in mission. I did Superfund cleanup programs for almost 20 years, 15, 20 years when I was at EPA. And then I moved into IT. And I love the pace of operations. And that's when I got to learn cybersecurity. And I had great teachers. My chief information security officers had great patience with me because I just look at them and go, I don't get what you're telling me. I just don't get it. And it is hard to get across to people what cybersecurity is because it's blind. It's invisible.
Yes.
Right? If you say somebody, oh, you've got a mouse infestation, you can just show them mouse things and they get it. Little cybersecurity things we could see because we had access to the network, but you'd have to translate it and then they wouldn't believe you because cybersecurity is this big, giant blind risk. And if you keep it a big, giant blind risk, your business could go out. Yeah,
it's funny. It's largely invisible. The most time that it's visible is when it's not there. When you don't have it. Gets pretty visible pretty quick.
Oh gosh, yes.
But when it's perfect and it's all functional, everything's secure, no one knows.
It is. And now try explaining to people that there are cybersecurity issues in space.
Oh gosh, yes.
It's way out there. What do you mean? Because they think I think people think of burglars, right? The little sack over and deet in a window, through the window, and all of that.
For a big surprise if they think physical access means anything anymore.
It isn't that, and I think it's part of changing the imagination, right? I want more cybersecurity science fiction books, and so that you can imagine the worst thing, and then you work on it. The big cyber guys in their capes and cyber gals in their capes and stuff. But if we use fiction to help us deal with these types of risks, I think it would be a lot easier for folks. We are coming along as society, but when I was started in this, it was, no, go away. And you're like,
We still get a fair amount of that, to be honest.
Oh, gosh.
Less of it, but we still get some of it.
Yeah. And that's disappointing because I thought we had, right? I thought we're making progress. We're making progress. That's
great. Pretty common day for me is I'll take a call from a small business. And they've been told by the government, do some cybersecurity. It's sort of how they hear it. Yeah. And it's implement these requirements. And they'll start asking us, well, what does it take? Like, how long does it take you guys to do this, to get it out of my way? And I'm like, it's kind of a business process and it needs to be maintained. It's like accounting and payroll and HR. It's something you kind of have to continue to do. And they're very much like, no, I haven't been doing it for the longest time and my business is fine. So no, why do I have to do it? So we still deal with that. Now we still also get a lot of companies who are in and they get the value, and we are seeing progress. So it is good.
Good. Well, keep up the good work. Yeah.
We're trying.
I like the improving part because you just hear these big headlines and you say to yourself, insurance doesn't buy down that risk anymore, right? That's definitely changing. And I think that's going to change in space too.
Space. Okay. So I want to talk about your EPA career before we get to NASA and then everything from there. You mentioned, you left the law idea, sort of found your way over to the EPA. You fell in love with that mission. Tell me about that mission.
So I worked most of my career at EPA. The longest stretch of my career was in the Superfund program. And this is cleaning up hazardous contaminated sites, hazardous waste.
Would I be surprised how much of that there is?
Probably. I realized when people would go on vacation with me, I was probably a little bit maybe Cliff Clavin from Cheers, who would just spout out these facts that people probably didn't want to know.
Like about the destination you're in?
Oh, yeah, right. We would go by, I'm like, I know this harbor. This harbor had blah, 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 right? This kind of contamination.
This waste out of
exactly. Or the water, it's going to be another 30 years until XYZ is out of the water system. And then I worked in federally owned properties, which is Department of Defense and Department of Energy. And I even worked on all 5 base closure programs on the economic redevelopment side, which was matching economic redevelopment goals with your cleanup programs. Right. So I can even pull together NASA and my time at EPA. So at NASA, at the Ames facility, it's a former base, and there was a dirigible, a blimp.
Oh yeah,
the blimp thing that was there, it's a wooden skeleton on that one. And the first time I went to NASA, I looked at that and I went, "Oh my gosh, this has PCB contaminations in it." And NASA, you tried to put your children's child care center close to that, and we wouldn't let you. And they look at me. I'm like, okay, see, right? This time I should have used an inside voice. But by this time, when I had gotten to NASA, they had actually the property was being used by Google. But in the NASA facility, the daycare center was over here. And based on what I could remember of the PCB contamination and all of that, it was really just in the dirigible place, and it had not gotten into the groundwater, at least at the time when we were doing that. So it was like, oh, okay. So I chatted with the environmental folks at NASA just to make sure of some things, even though I was the NASA CIO at this point and had nothing to do with EPA.
Were they surprised, like, hold on, how does our CIO know all this?
Yeah, there was a little bit of that. And then they put 2 and 2 together, because when I went down to our Alabama facility, it was the donut hole, right? It was largely an Army contamination when there was this little donut hole in the middle that was contamination potentially attributed to NASA. So I was like, oh yeah, I do know NASA, don't I? A little bit about it. And so what you try to do when you're doing the cleanup is, because this is taxpayer-funded work, I'm actually a Superfund taxes are not quite from the taxpayer directly, but cleanup of federally owned properties are direct taxpayer-funded through the defense bills or Department of Energy bills. And so we always tried to take a common sense approach. What makes sense? And in this case for BRAC, what makes sense for economic viability of these communities losing their bases? I mean, many of them just lost the bases completely, and they needed to reuse this property to bring in businesses, homes, whatever they envisioned their community for the future. So we would try to match them up. So yeah, sometimes traveling with me, it would be a little like, oh, okay, point out, oh, there was a TCE there. I hope the groundwater pump and treat system on the TCE is still working over there, because if it collects inside, it's really not good for the people. And then after a while, you just have to stop saying those things.
I had a conversation. This is so funny. I had a conversation at the National 8A conference a couple months back. Mm-hmm. We met a company from Alaska, and we were talking to them, and they were telling me their work is cleaning up an old military base, essentially. And they're like, we're basically dealing with a ton of diesel in the ground, and these like deteriorated diesel tanks, these 1940s bunkers and stuff, munitions everywhere. And I was, I'm born and bred in Northern Virginia. I'm like, wait, what? Mm-hmm. That's still a problem on American soil, that we're cleaning up diesel tanks from World War II?
We would. So sure, certainly. And those could be also formerly used defense sites. right? And yes, we are. I actually helped negotiate some stuff on the formerly used defense sites work with the Corps of Engineers, who's largely the one responsible for that program for the Department of Defense. And absolutely, we were all over the place. I mean, we've got contamination, PCB contamination in some of the islands, like the Northern Marianas Islands, and that there's tanks still there. We've got a little bit of waste still in a lot of different places. It's, and, the government, and we can all judge it, but, do the best they can with the resources they get to address the contamination and the impacts that it has on the communities and the health of the communities and the viability of these communities. It's always a delicate balance. You could throw trillions at this problem, and what's your purpose? What's your end goal? And sometimes you just want to clean it up so we say bugs and bunnies can live there safely. And there's plenty of facilities. Have you ever flown to Denver?
I have. Okay.
When you come in on Pena Boulevard, I think it is, those are former facilities along there. And you notice there's a lot of wildlife and there's this strip with not a lot of development because it can't be developed. It's pretty contaminated. And so the decision is that they'd monitor the wildlife that's there and they would just let that property never get developed, and put institutional controls in place to do that. And I always keep an eye on that when I go by it to make sure we don't do it, because made the decision not to do a really expensive cleanup and opted for institutional controls and allow it to be a nice buffer zone with wildlife. And the wildlife is thriving because I saw a wolf there. I think it was a wolf. It looked like a wolf. And there's all sorts of hooved critters running around there and things like that. So those are options too, right? It doesn't have to turn into a home or to a shopping plaza. It can become a wildlife place or a place where you can walk along path. And we've done this with unexploded ordnance. You mentioned the UXO. And in that, what we usually would do in the government is we'd have trails where people could walk, and there are big signs that say, don't leave the trail. And if you see something that looks like this, call the phone number. And please do, because if it looks like this, we don't know the behavior of that unexploded ordnance.
Man, okay, this is really opening up my perspective. So the podcast, we call it The Watchers. Mm-hmm. The idea behind it was like, who's looking out for us? And in my very literal, like, cybersecurity, national security, the EPA. Yeah. I mean, what a major institution for looking out for us, and the awareness of it. I mean, again, I had a conversation where I was mind boggled that problem hadn't been cleared up and that we were still dealing with that.
Yeah, and we will for a very long time. Yeah, so they're watchers, right? Clean water. Absolutely. You and I live in an area where, it's easy to get tap water and it's easy to take a shower in clean water and all of that. That's not always the case around the world. No. And Flint, Michigan certainly learned that was a problem coming out of their tap as well. So we have, sometimes humans forget history and repeat it. Other times we get careless or we're naive. Sometimes we do the best we can with what we know and it's just not enough. We'll go back to our point of learning, right? If you're in charge of a city council, then a healthy community is a healthy economic community too. And so what do you need to do to ensure your community thrives? And that's a big issue.
Yeah.
You've got health, you've got finance, you've got your environment, you've got recreation that goes on there. You've got to have a tax base so that you can do the money that's associated with that. And you've got to have leaders that are willing to lead with their heart and do right by the community that they're serving.
Are you still like close to people at the EPA? Because I know it was a political cudgel for a while. I mean, it was in the crosshairs by certain people. And I think there was an appointed director of the EPA who was fairly antagonistic toward the mission. Has it survived that? Is it in its form that it should be and doing what it should be doing?
EPA survived that. I mean, that's the point of the civil service, is that we take our oath to the Constitution. And those that are called political appointees, and it's a great job, they serve for the president. And so there's a delicate balance in all the agencies, especially regulatory agencies, when incoming has the political people have a different idea of what the agency should or shouldn't be doing in its actions. And it's up to the civil servants to be the guardians of the Constitution in anything that you do. And it, from my perspective, I'm a tree hugger too. And I would say that, my friends and all of that were really good guardians. I could say that the agency certainly took a hit at a minimum on the morale side. Nobody likes to hear that the career that they chose, the thing that they love is
the noble cause too that they're serving.
And they don't want to hear negative things about it or, see things happen that they feel threaten all of that. But, the good news is humans are resilient. And so the agency is coming through that. They've certainly learned from that. And they're, finding their footing again for those areas that were affected considerably. Not every area of EPA was hit really, really hard, but the agency certainly took a morale hit. But they're back and working hard at that one.
We had a conversation on the podcast. We had Andrew McCabe, who was the deputy director of the FBI.
Yeah.
And one of the things we talked about is the cultural thing happening now. There's a lot of distrust of institutions, and that institution as well, the FBI and the intelligence institutions have also been demoralized recently because there's been such an attack on institutions where, my experience, limited as it has been, I've only ever met people in those institutions who really cared about it.
Yeah.
The whole cynical take on things, that hasn't been my experience. Is there some? Of course, especially in the political appointee space, there are agendas, but I consistently find people who serve institutions at that level, but also at like the local level, are almost always well-motivated. They're there. They're not being compensated amazingly well. These aren't the highest paying jobs they can get. They're there to support the mission. It sucks to me as a taxpayer and someone who believes in, our institutions to hear that they're having to be resilient at all. And they can't just focus on doing the good work, frankly, the noble work that they're supposed to be doing.
It is always in elections. So I'm since I retired from NASA, I have been reading one book on each president in order of presidency.
Ooh. Oh, man.
Yeah. So
what a great adventure that is.
It has been a great adventure.
Who are you on?
I just broke open Polk.
Okay.
Because it took me a long time to get through. It took me a while to get through Jackson. Well, because his response to any affront was let's fight.
Of course.
But once I kind of started to push through, that's going to be his reaction. I could actually read. He felt himself to be a patriot. He was big on keeping the Union together, the Union that existed at that point, just like all the presidents previous to him.
This is phenomenal.
It's really cool. I can tell you about a faster way to do it. And that is that my advisor on what book to read, his name is David Fisher. And David Fisher wrote the President Chronicles. And it's, I think, a 3-volume set, and it's about 150 pages on every president in order of presidency. So you can go the route. And he has a YouTube channel where there are 8 to 10 minute videos on every president.
I like that.
So I really advise people, I would go David Fisher route because it'll be a lot faster. Because it's really cool, the things that get open. I've got a little more time on my hand than you do. And
it's all right. I still dive deep. Like I did the John Adams
yes,
audiobook.
That's a great book.
It's like 44 hours on audio. So I get it when I can.
Right. But this way, 8 to 10 minutes a day, a little YouTube video, right? And you could read the books, 150 pages, right? It's a great thing to do. But in reading these books, it's a reminder that in political campaigns, which every election is a political election, I'm not making a comment about it, is somebody gets put down. And a lot of times they put down, I'm in a clean house. Our civil servants aren't doing X, Y, Z. Well, so you have to be resilient because that happens in every election. And that's why back to you and I talked about leadership in when you start to head into a presidential election, there's the Hatch Act because you can't violate the integrity or the ethics associated with what's going on. And don't do it. It's really not worth it. I never did, but I read a number of stories. I'm like, why is this worth doing? But so you tell you people, this is just propaganda. Somebody is marketing themselves to get elected. Yes, they've decided that on your backs and by insulting you and your work, that's a good thing. They don't know you. They don't know, honestly, they probably don't even know about your agency. Right. You need to just hold your head up. You need to focus on the mission. We're going to get a new set of politicals in here, and we're going to help them be the best that they can be at this agency. And I said, you can come in and we can complain and we can grouse about it. But when that little gripe session is over, you're going to go out there and you're going to do your job and you're going to treat everybody with respect and dignity, whether they're a political appointee or the person that works next to you. And what you do is important to the public. And you just have to give them these pep talks all the time, because I would look at it, I'm like, oh my gosh, where'd you get your information? Right? And you're just like, whatever, they're trying to get elected. And you're like, you just let them go do it. And a lot of times when the political appointees come in, there's a lot of aha moments going on.
Right.
You're right there like, oh, I didn't know this. Right? Oh, okay, well, now you do, and let's work together and do that. Yeah. So, I loved being in public service. I tried to avoid it. I loved it. I did it for 30 years. I highly recommend it to anybody to do. You're right. You're not going to get rich, but, save your money and have a good investment strategy. And, I did retire. Everyone looks at me and like, you were pretty young when you retired. I'm like, yeah, I was. And because I took retirement financially very seriously, which is sort of a top tip, is you should be saving 25% of your salary from the moment you're getting a salary.
Index funds?
I only do index funds, right? Because as a CIO, I couldn't have.
Oh, that's fair.
I couldn't be
Federal
invested
CIO?
in. Right? Yeah, I have Microsoft.
We just buy the Boeing stock.
Exactly.
Or something.
We're just going to do this,
NASA.
right? And after a while, you're just like, I can't buy something and have a balanced portfolio, as they say, and stay away from my job and any ethics. So I said, index fund, no decision by my side, and off I went. Shouldn't
surprise anybody who's listened to you so far that financial independence was a goal, and an outcome you achieved.
I like to think so.
Sounds like it. If you were able to retire,
I did, and the government package is really good for retirement, so they encourage that. So I was fortunate and made good decisions, and we saved the money for retirement, and that's what we focused on. So it was a few less things of this, a few less things, and a little bit more savings, and it's all fine. It's all great. We had some experiences. But we haven't talked enough about NASA yet. I bet you're going there.
Yes,
let's go there.
I was going to say, is there anything between EPA and NASA we need to discuss, or can I jump right to NASA?
No, somewhere, but the point of walking across the National Mall, so EPA was on one side, NASA headquarters, I had to give up my clearance.
In DC?
In DC, yes. And so I had to give up my clearance, but I never left the United States government, and it took forever to get my clearance back and reinstated when I went from EPA to
from one
NASA.
Agency to another, really?
Exactly. I know. You're like,
that's how it goes.
So on a Saturday, I was an EPA employee. At midnight or 12:01 on Sunday, I was a NASA employee, and it took 4 months to get my tickets reestablished. And so I missed 4 months of amazing briefings on what's going on in space with cybersecurity.
What year was this?
2015.
Okay. So how big of a difference EPA to NASA? Was it like
huge?
Okay. Really?
Yeah. So the first question people usually ask is, well, why did you leave EPA?
Yeah.
And my answer was, I saw what we were doing to Mother Earth, and I needed a way off of it. And I knew NASA had a way off of it. And so then I could find a place with chocolate and red wine. The things I love the most besides my family. Yeah. And so, but that's not really what it was, I'd mentioned previously, I really liked the operations and I wanted to actually be better. And I felt that better meant I needed to leave EPA. And it took me over a year to get mentally prepared to leave EPA. It's where I effectively grew up. At this point, I had
you'd spent a long time there.
25 years there.
Wow.
Yeah. Married, kid, all of life's milestones happen, many happen in 25 years. So, and I figured that NASA and FEMA job were open. And so I was more interested in FEMA because I felt more comfortable going over to a place where, because I'd worked a little bit in emergency response.
There.
Yeah, a lot of crossover. And, all the responses that I had been aware of FEMA was that, or it was the Coast Guard for the Horizon oil spill, BP oil spill and that. So I was like, why am I going to go to NASA? I'm like, what's that going to be? And so it's the job offer I got. And I'm like, okay, I was mentally prepared to leave. So I took the first job offer. And I went and I got there as their deputy, and I failed at that because a few weeks after I arrived at NASA, they said, we'd like you to be the CIO. And my response, honestly, was I'd like to know where the bathroom is on a regular basis because I was getting lost in the building all the time, even though it's a rectangle and it's the same pretty much on every floor, but it took my brain a long time to figure this out. And that was my answer. But I said, okay, let me think about it. And then I said yes. A couple weeks later, after meeting my bosses, I thought that would be a good idea to meet some of my bosses before I said that I would take a job.
Smart.
Yeah, whatever. So I decided, since I knew how to find a federal job, that if I failed miserably as the NASA CIO, I knew how to find a job and I would be okay.
You'd be all right.
I'd be okay. And so I said yes to the job, and I loved the job. I can tell you within, what made it, I think, a little easier is I had an amazing team. So all of the chief information officers for the centers reported to me, and there were a couple of them there that were top notch. And talk about being vulnerable. I walked in and I'm going, NASA is so complex. And the people at NASA, one of the big differences between NASA and EPA, the people at NASA love NASA. People at EPA love the environment.
Important distinction.
It is. And so I'm like, oh my gosh, what did I say yes to? And then I was on a learning journey. And I knew that I had landed in some foreign country where I didn't know the language because the acronyms. I sat next, thank goodness for the people that I sat next to at these big meetings. James Webb Space Telescope. I've got my little CIO seat to it. I've got commercial crew, right? SpaceX. Yeah. We're reviewing. This was pre-SpaceX launching and bringing crew members to station. And I'm sitting there next to the engineer and the chief medical officer or the lawyer. I was always sitting next to one of those folks. And I was just writing Post-it note after Post-it note to the chief engineer, him or his deputy, right? And I'm like, does this mean this? Because they would just use these mathematical engineering science terms right over my head. And he's like, yeah, you've got it. I'm like, oh, I'm finally getting to understand this stuff. Now, could I build a rocket? No. Right? Could I design the return samples from Mars or return samples from an asteroid? No. But could I understand what they meant by the robotics landing on something that's going 17,000 miles an hour?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fast. That's fast. That's hard.
Yeah.
Right? And do you have a cybersecurity plan? Because, by the way, you can get attacked in space. And so I just basically turned on, I know nothing. I have control over nothing. I'm open to learning and then having the challenging conversations when it was necessary. And I ended up leading two very large transformational projects at NASA, including overhauling their cybersecurity posture, which was pretty hard, but it was really fun. Really fun. I can say that. I can
imagine. Yeah, when you're in the thick of it, I'm sure it was awful.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, yes. We do what?
Pressure. Yeah.
We did what? We have what? When we turned on, for the first ever, when CDM was coming in, the Continuous Diagnostic and Mitigation Program, and I went from EPA to NASA, right, when all of this is happening. And so I'm talking to the folks, and I'm like, so how do we do this? How do we do that? I knew the basics because my team had trained me. And they're like, well, we don't do that. Monitoring.
Yeah, it's kind of important.
I'm like, well, aren't the first two basic questions of cybersecurity who and what's on your network? Mm-hmm. So we can't answer those questions? Mm-mm. And I'm like, we've got work to do.
Boy, do we.
Up is where we're going. This is awesome. And then the White House kind of came in and gave us a little bit of a pep talk. Maybe not a pep talk, maybe a do better talk, but I'll call it a pep talk. And from there,
some motivation.
A motivational speech. That's what it was. They are so inspiring there.
Sure.
And from that time, we brought in the monitoring equipment and we turned that thing on and we found 40,000 pieces of software.
Love, hate it.
Yes, exactly. And one of those pieces of software was Reader Rabbit, which I happen to have known because it was one of my son's favorite programs. And I'm going, we've got work.
Does NASA need Reader Rabbit?
Apparently we do.
Yes.
Apparently we do.
Someone decided.
Well, now you know that our network was flat.
Oh,
Reader Rabbit in the daycare center shows up everywhere. Let's start segmentation, right? And so on our journey, we were great team, great folks that were willing to tell me, give me feedback, both me as me and a leader, as well as what we ought to be doing, and advise me on the mission and how to work with the mission. And I'm, happy to say that we were invited in on a couple of occasions, which was great. We got yelled at. I got yelled at a lot, at which point, usually the end of the conversation was, I really appreciate you sharing with me how you feel about it. But if you ever do this to anybody that works with me, we're going to have a conversation. And somebody did. And it was a high up in a center. And I called them out on it. And I will tell you that it never happened again, because one of the things, you run a company. The most important thing to you when you're in charge of an organization is your people. If you take care of them, they will take care of the work.
If you're properly motivated, I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
I think some people don't see that.
Yes, but then, they would say, how well do you know them? They had great stories at NASA, and Mike Massimo, an astronaut, has written a book called Moonshot, and I highly recommend that book. And the reason why is because he left a meeting that any of us could have left any time in our life. And one of the engineers, always at the end of the meeting, I'm doing a little drama here, always at the end of the meeting would speak up going, oh, what about this issue? How many of us have been ready to leave a meeting and somebody brings up this big issue? And what's your reaction? Exactly. So
happens regularly.
Exactly. So Mike leans over to or walking out or runs into the hallway, says this, like, every time so-and-so, we're about to end the meeting and big issue comes up. And that senior astronaut looks at him and says, seems to me the problem is you and you don't know him. And you know what?
Wow.
It's right. So Mike took it as a challenge. It's all in the book, and he tells it far better than I do. But I like to tell this story because I don't know how many people in my life I have dismissed, and I shouldn't have. I should never have done that. Or I've written them off. Yep, they're on the Renee hate list, right? And no, don't do that. Because one, you may be hurting that person's mental health. You don't know if they admire you or could care less about you. You never know your impression on anybody unless they give you feedback. And then I don't, half the time I'd be like,
even then, yeah.
Right, exactly. You're just like, oh, well, maybe. And so Mike set out to get to know this person. And in getting to know him, they built a trust relationship and he could give him feedback. You're saying the right things, but you need to say them sooner in the meeting.
Right, instead of tossing the grenade.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But maybe that person felt more valued by tossing the grenade. Well, then they needed a mirror shined on them to be a better, more effective person. Effective communication is the difference between life and death.
Especially at a place like NASA.
Absolutely. If you can't communicate a problem and get others to understand, you're failing. Now, the people around you are also failing if they're dismissing you or whatever. But you owe someone in an organization, if they're sending a red flag or not sending a red flag, to get them to do better in their communication and in those skills and sharing that information. And you also need to tell your people and your managers and your supervisors to never be afraid of people speaking up, because it is the lack of speaking up, and I've said this already, that kills people. 40 plus people have lost their lives in pursuit of space exploration. Those issues were known.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is that a well understood lesson at NASA now?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And my goal when I was doing cybersecurity was because cybersecurity and safety have they intermix.
Definitely.
And so it was to point out that for us to be a safety-driven culture, which they were, we had to be a cyber-driven culture along the same thing. We still needed to make missions happen. We still needed to turn science fiction into fact for the benefit of humanity. But we needed to have safety and cybersecurity as part of that whole issue. And I can tell you, and people are like, oh, you're just saying that because you guys always do so well on the federal viewpoint survey. And I'm like, no. Let me tell you a thing. When I had personnel files out in my office, I always kept the drawer open, because when I was leaving, I would always want to lock those personnel files back up. But I left the door open so I wouldn't forget.
Leave that out.
And leave it out. I didn't want personnel files ever left on my desk. And every time this one guy who's the deputy chief information security officer would be in my office, and this was the situation where I'm working on personnel stuff and the file's open, he's like, that's a safety infraction. And I went, you are absolutely right, Rob. And I thank you for making sure that I know that. Right? Didn't matter. That was part of my system. But he would point out that was a safety infraction every time he walked in. And I was grateful for him to do it.
Good.
Right. Exactly. You should be able to tell your boss a safety infraction. Yeah. And so it is very much part of the culture. Safety is, been in many a clean room all garbed up and stuff like that. And you get your safety briefing. When I flew at 43,000 feet to look at a space telescope out of an airplane.
43,000 feet.
Yeah, it was very cool.
Not a lot of people have been that far.
No, we stared at Ganymede for the evening, and we looked at Jupiter, and we almost flew to Russia when we did in Russian airspace when we did this. And so it was really cool. But we had our big flight safety briefing, and that was pretty cool, right? I was just like sitting there, like I'm at the table and going, where's the parachute in case I need to get out to do this? But yeah, we have used to have, I think it was actually just recently retired or about to be retired. It's an airplane. It's a partnership with a German space agency. And you get up to 40 to 43,000 feet. There's a big giant hole that opens up in the back of that airplane, and a telescope drops down, and scientists are staring at space.
How do I get to do this?
Well, I got to do it because I was the CIO, and I had a lot of supporters that believed I had to understand the mission in order to be the CIO. And it turns out that was their second flight to do software testing. And so I sat with the team while they were doing their software testing on the flight. And then, of course, I had to ask, how are you going to do data transfer? And data transfer was sneaker net. I'm like, well, how are you making sure that USB port is secure and not dropping in that? And so I ended up doing a very light cybersecurity audit on this particular flight.
It was important that you were there. I mean,
exactly.
It's good. You gotta be there to ask those questions.
Right. And we flew all night, and it was a really cool experience to be able to do that.
So, I want to go back to safety and tie back to something you said, that the people at NASA love NASA. Mm-hmm. It's obviously it's revered in popular culture. It's revered for its innovation, for the human progress that it represents, for its response, I guess, at some level to the tragedies that have happened there. But it's a lesson, I think, that you can prioritize safety and still be innovative. Mm-hmm. In my world, down in cybersecurity land and whatnot, technical land, there's a lot of pushing back against security campaigns because it's going to slow us down. It's going to create drag and all that sort of stuff. If NASA can do it, you can do it.
Right. I think that's absolutely right. I think when you laid that out, Andy, it's change. Humans, if they want to change, like if I decide, well, I've decided this for a lifetime, I'm going to lose 5 pounds, right?
I decided that this morning.
There you go. That's your choice, your change. You're going to think about your choices. But if someone tells you you're going to lose 5 pounds.
It's the worst.
No, I'm going to fight it every step of the way.
Yeah. Simon
Sinek says the why of something.
Yep.
And cyber is hard to get at the why. But what cyber is if you're doing something, it's all about risk and risk management. And so you lay out, what are your big risks? We had the 5x5 at NASA, which I was like, what's that? I had to learn. So YouTube, thank goodness for YouTube. And then being able to sit in meetings with somebody and go, okay, what do you mean by that? And how did you decide that was our top risk, right? On a 5x5 matrix, likelihood and consequence.
Yep.
And those are always, briefed out at all of our major, actually it's every project at NASA where they would brief that out. And then what was your mitigation strategy? And sometimes it's watch. Right? I can't imagine what's going on right now with the Boeing Starliner. Right? Launch, scrub, scrub again. Well, they're looking hard at that 5x5 matrix and to make sure that no lives are lost on that Starliner. And it's that detailed and it is that complex. Yes, we can point to other people landing on the moon. We dock with International Space Station on a regular basis. But it's hard. But what we've done is we've learned the risks. We've innovated. Change is hard at NASA because if it works one way and lives aren't lost, you better have a really good reason to change off of that. Totally understand that. Like in medical.
Yeah.
For heart attack reaction, AEDs are out there, right? That's a life-saving thing.
Yep.
Right? That was a big change, which is change just to save lives. If we started to take those away, people would be in uproar, as they should be.
Absolutely.
Right? You don't make a change that's life-saving like this. It's not a new tech shiny thing. So you just, from the beginning, you outline your risks. And sometimes you pound them flat, as they say, and other times you just carry them forward. But it takes imagination. It takes willingness to listen and learn from each other. And if you're somebody in a CIO role where you're changing everybody, you're moving everyone's cheese all the time, then you get good at messaging, or you get good people good at messaging. I'm like, what's a better message? Because this didn't go so well. And you put yourself out there to be yelled at. You put yourself out there to answer questions. And you put yourself out there to make sure that they know that you really care about the mission, and that you'll always listen to them, even if they aren't very pleasant. Yeah, but change is about following a change management model. There's several out there that are really good, but really begin with the why. And that cybersecurity why is all my stuff's at China.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's the same assumption.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have, right? The minute I go to China, although I don't know if I'm going to ever go, right? Oh, welcome. Glad you're finally here. We've had your data for 10 years.
We know exactly where you want to stay.
Exactly.
Your dinner will be here, as we know.
Exactly.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And that doesn't seem to bother people that they lose customer, faith. You look at the UHC breach. You look at Ticketmaster right now. I haven't done a deep dive on that. And that's my information you were careless with. Or maybe, as you and I know, the guys on the other side are really good, and gals are really good at what they're doing. And now all these AI-driven tools and stuff, they're starting to put into use.
They are good, but we don't make them try hard enough.
Oh, gosh, isn't that the truth? That's like I used to say when the auditors would come to my team. Make it hard for them to do their job so that they find something we needed to learn about.
Right.
Don't give them the easy stuff.
Right. We know the easy stuff.
Right.
100%.
Absolutely. Right. 2-factor authentication. There's an easy thing.
It's the easiest thing ever now.
Monitor your network. Right? There are some simple, low-cost options to really get yourself into a better position. And then, if you understand your data, large complex organizations don't want to pay to, do the big safe around all data, right? NASA has data that goes out in the public 24 hours. Well, I need to put different parameters on protecting the confidentiality and the integrity of that data and the accessibility of that data. That is different than astronaut health data, right? So make it different. It's hard, especially when you've, grown up in an organization that didn't have this. Your networks are flat.
It's all flat, exactly.
Stuff.
Yeah,
exactly. But that's the fun
Man,
stuff.
what an arbiter of change you must have been.
Yeah, probably. Right. I think I was. I didn't intend to do that. I had a good friend of mine.
Sounded like it was necessary, though.
It was. Why waste money on IT?
Big question.
Do you really need 53 SharePoint sites, different ones licensed? Probably not, right? There's sort of, but IT grew up where it wasn't enterprise-wide when it first started. It was put on your computers and people could buy it and just put it on their computer because they needed it. And I would always want you to have what you needed, but we didn't need to have 53 versions of it because that's not SharePoint. And that's just share hoarding. You're like, no, that's my SharePoint. I'm just talking about myself.
Yeah.
And that. So yeah, you learn tricks of the trade and you can't take it personally. Although there were days I did take it personally, and just because you get kind of tired of people telling you what to do and all of that. And as I close out, I about quit the job once because I found out that NASA's an e-route provider of the internet.
Is it really?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Wikipedia.
Interesting.
It's right there. I found out. I got to tell my bosses, did you know that we run the internet? They're like, what? And I'm like, let me bring the team in so that you understand what we're sitting on right now, because it's a huge geopolitical issue that it's a game we're in. We're not a big player in because of Department of Defense and State Department and that, but it's a game we're in and you guys might need to know about this. And so we briefed them on running an e-route of the internet.
And now they know.
And I wonder if they still know. They did know.
At least whoever was there at the time.
Right. And that was it was kind of a like, oh, that's cool, but then it was also very scary. Right. And I actually went to look at the servers.
Yeah,
when I was on a trip, I went, yes, I do want to see our equipment that's running the internet, please. I don't know. I won't do anything and I it'll be useless. And I'm sorry to waste your time, but I just feel like I need to see it. And there it was, one of those cages.
Yep.
Locked behind the cage, little green blinking lights. Looks so cute.
Hardware from how long ago?
I didn't check.
Okay.
I didn't check.
You probably didn't want to know.
No, I didn't want to know. Yeah, hardware and software, supply chain risk management. Big issue for national security.
One.
Absolutely. We were getting chewed on at NASA by my dear friends at GAO. And if he ever listens to this, he knows why I emphasize that. Dear friend now. And actually was then because he was a good listener. And so we were getting chewed on about cybersecurity and supply chain risk management. And I seldom would do this. I just looked at my chief information security officer, by the way, the best one in the United States federal government, and he is still there now.
Awesome. Okay.
Yes, he helped stand up CISA. And I leaned into him. I'm like, just get them off our backs. I'm like, I'm so tired of the same audit over and over again. They're right. You know they're right. I support you. Let's just get started with something. And he built out an amazing program. And it was funny. We would go to these briefings on supply chain risk management, and we would go together because if they were going to beat on the agencies, I should be the one being beaten on, not my people doing their best. And they was like, oh, NASA.
Leadership lesson there.
It is. Don't let them go alone. Don't do it. And then, so we're sitting there like, great job, NASA. You're the gold standard. And he and I would just look at each other like, oh my gosh, no, we are not the gold standard. Because we knew what was under the hood, right? We knew what was going on. But he built out really, I think, a program that is actually an excellent model for the United States government. Yeah.
I want to ask a question about Columbia and Challenger and those types of disasters at NASA. I mean, does that still weigh heavily on the collective conscience over there? Is it discussed? Is it out in the open?
Yeah, it is. Maybe not so well. Yes, both are talked about a lot. The Columbia shuttle, the CABE report, Columbia Accident Investigation Board, I believe is what the letters stand for. I hadn't been at NASA maybe 2 weeks when I heard about the CABE report. And I had to kind of lean
2015 still.
Yeah. I said, what's the CABE report? And so I got a copy of the report and I read it. And when one of the engineers on the program, he would do the briefing, the safety briefing for incoming new people to NASA. He was there. He was on program that dreadful day in NASA's history. And so he could really speak to its impact on the agency, on our culture, and on him in particular, as well as the others around him. And the Columbia shuttle pieces have a special room at the Kennedy Space Center. It's not open to the public. And knowing NASA's history and having perused the report, it's a longer report in that, but you can really kind of get a lot from the executive summary and that, and plus everybody talks about it. So in order to participate in the conversations, you kind of have to understand what's in the report. And in fact, I still have my copy. It's one of the things I took when I retired. I was like, I probably need to remember the lessons that in the CABE report for life, because they're real important ones. And communication's one of them, processes, listening, respect, culture. It's all about that. And so you can go into the Columbia room and, even me who wasn't there for any of it and really an outsider to something of that, it's an eerie room to go into.
I'm sure.
Because it's the components and you know what it looked like. That video. And EPA was part of the cleanup operations and because of the debris field, and that's who EPA was called upon to assist with that. So I was at EPA for one of them, and I was like, oh boy, that's got to be rough on our responders to be emotionally facing some of that. And they did do some support for our responders as they probably did at NASA. I wasn't there at the time, so I can't speak to how they supported the employees through that. So it was a dark piece to our history. And, that's the thing is dark pieces in history, dark pieces in personal history, organizational history. What I hope people look at NASA is that they can get through it.
Yeah, and they can use it properly. It sounds like it's been used and honored by, sounds like vowing to not make those mistakes again.
Yeah.
And the only way to do that is in 2015, that the incoming CIO should be told about something that happened 12 years ago. Mm-hmm. And the lesson's still there. I brought up before we started recording, I have from that day, I have a newspaper in my office that's framed. I was like, 15 at the time, but I remember saving it, one, because I was like, this is historic. Like, this definitely felt, again, I wasn't around for Challenger, but this had a similar cultural impact. It was post 9/11, so it was like the next bad thing that sort of happened. And I have it up in my office. I never really knew why I got attached to that. But I always had it in my office, and I still have it. And I just kind of have it as a reminder. I do IT and cybersecurity. I work from home. I work on a computer. It's not super serious work. At the end of the day, I get to go home and do my thing. It's not dangerous or anything like that. But I always have it there as kind of a reminder of, like, at some level, I'm serving a mission like that. And there's a cost to human progress, and there's a cost to mistakes when you're trying to innovate. In some fields, it's literal loss of life.
Yeah. And
I don't think it's healthy to lose sight of that. And I think that's one of the admirable things about NASA is that they're not hiding that away. Mm-mm. Right? They're not, of course, reveling in it. It's tragic. but they're honoring it properly, I think, and that sacrifice made by those people who would, of course, rather be alive with their kids and their families and everything. At least you're going to do right by them and make sure we don't make those mistakes again.
I think that's absolutely right. I'm going to challenge you, though, on cybersecurity. Cybersecurity could be the difference between life and death. Look at all of our medical equipment that is now hardware and software and mostly run by software. Something gets into that. And if you work with a company that's got the Internet of Things, health tech, right? And something gets in and spoils the oxygen flow or changes the flow on somebody, right? That is life or death. I mean, we've got cybersecurity has edges of life and death embedded in it. And hopefully we're the society, and not you and I, because we kind of get it, but is kind of waking up to our reliance. Well, we have a huge reliance in space, because I always want to remind you, you're not going to use your dating apps without space and satellites, because those are based on Google, on the, I just lost it out of my head, but our navigation systems are satellite based and all of that. So we rely on space every single day, but health tech and the bringing in and the use of it is great benefit. Remote medicine, we're able to do things so cool, but if you don't have appropriate cyber controls on that, on your Internet of Things, a remote doctor doing surgery with lasers and all of that, and there's a hiccup.
Yeah, there's a blip in that. That could move the arm that little bit. And these are millimeters of mistake.
Exactly.
We've seen the real impact there. It's kind of easy to dismiss it, but the hospitals that I've worked or that I've taken patients to, we haven't had a stroke center. And so the protocol has always been, you have a stroke, you bring it in, and they'll have a remote console, and they'll wheel up basically a TV for a neurosurgeon to evaluate a patient remotely. That relies on the fact that that surgeon can access you remotely, and that's entirely in our planning. And so if that goes down, that's slowing care, and that can be loss of life. It can certainly be loss of function. We also see these hospitals keep getting hit with ransomware. And brings down their whole system. Having worked in a hospital, they run on their computer systems.
Oh, yeah.
From the orders I got as a technician of where I needed to go at what time to what treatments are happening, it certainly makes the whole medical system, when it's hit, way less effective. And an impacted medical system can cause loss of life.
Absolutely. And they're the two. And see, to me, one of my dream board jobs would to actually be on a hospital board.
We need to start this campaign.
Right. And partly because the SEC rules on cybersecurity. So yes, I have the cybersecurity part, but it's to bring the customer experience, the user experience with cybersecurity and IT for the benefit of those that are served by this hospital. And somebody with an IT background, with also sustainability, I did work in waste, and that, could really bring. People don't like different perspectives, but it brings a perspective that I think would enrich the bottom line.
Absolutely.
When I saw what happened to UHC, a bunch of us are a bunch of cybersecurity professionals, and we're like, boy, if one of us could just be on a board and you can help guide likelihood and consequence, get to those risk matrix and change their enterprise risk model to include IT and cybersecurity, or strengthen how they consider it and focus on what it means from bottom line. Because in some cases, putting in some of those cyber protections actually could reduce costs. Using robotic processing, using AI, which AI in the medical field is definitely going beautifully, right? Yeah. But then there's a bunch of worries associated with how the model's trained. Where's the model trained? Who's funding the model? All the questions we ask on the supply chain risk side.
Where's that data going?
Exactly. Yeah. And I just would like to see people realize more and more of our daily lives. My car is just a bunch of software, but it is not hooked to my home network. I'll just let you know. I'm like, no, I'll let the dealer do it. I'm not letting it go on my network at all. I check my network.
So you won't have a choice, because soon it'll just 5G back home, because they want that that data.
Sure, they can on their network, not mine, because I don't know what somebody's going to do to my car. right? You know, and I'm not smart enough to figure out how to protect I guess I drive. Is it operational technology or is it IoT or is it IT? I don't know what cars are.
Why not both or all three?
I guess they're all three. And that is just, people just need to be aware, and you can have great conversations.
Well, you made a really good point there, one that I love to iterate whenever I do public talks and stuff on security, which is good security is the result of good engineering. Mm-hmm. Good engineering also results in efficiency and better processes, things like automation. A lot of the security outcomes my organization achieves are just good engineering, making processes less manual, taking the human factor, because that's often the main security problem. Yeah. So we get major net benefit in almost all things when we're achieving a security outcome by also achieving an engineering outcome.
I think you're absolutely right. And it's you get to show your clients that on a regular basis. And I think that's people think of, cybersecurity as an add-on thing, and it's an embedded
thing. Cost center.
Exactly. Yes. And if you do it well, sure, there are pieces that are cost center, like you need to pay to have your network monitored and things like that. And it's two-factor authentication. Sure, I get that there's pieces of cost, but you can also drive out inefficiencies in processes when you bring in some good cybersecurity processes. And, it's about bringing in the people to say, how can we make your life a little easier with those processes?
We need you on more boards.
I'd love to be.
We need people with that perspective on more boards because, again, like I told you, we still see plenty of pushback and plenty that don't get it. Mm-hmm. And it's to the point, it's 2024. There aren't lines of business that are not dependent heavily on IT anymore. Yeah. I mean, if there are, I don't know what they are.
I've spent a little bit of time this past year in the rural areas, right? And I'm shaking my phone as if it's an Etch-a-Sketch. Like, that's going to get me, I know, that's going to get me better service. Like, it's like, no, it's not going to do that. And so I think your access to fast internet is where that's where the businesses and life is run on IT.
Yeah.
Or OT or IoT. Just
society runs on that.
Exactly. Now. In the rural areas, but I'm not talking farming, because farming, those tractors are just big giant IoT things that happen to drop plows and put seeds in the earth. But they're collecting all sorts of data, which is beneficial to the financial health of the farmer as well as the quality of the crops. And it's great stuff. But there are places that don't have that. So there's a few places that don't have that, which will be a little bit more bricks and mortar and pen and paper. Yeah. But it's all a matter of time until that changes. And hopefully they're thinking about how to be more secure from day one when they go more and more tech oriented, or not if they choose not to. But yeah, the rural areas, I do remember, I'm like, I don't have internet access on this. And well, aren't I a little spoiled child right now?
Yeah. A couple of years ago, I lived on a house on a couple acres, old farmhouse out in sticks. And I spent the first couple of years there just on a 4G connection. I started my company on it. I'm like, this is ironic. I'm supposed to be a fast-moving, high-tech guy, and my internet's spotty. So happily in the suburbs now, where I have cable. Yeah. But there's a lot of folks who still don't have access to that. I wonder, do you think internet access is at this point almost like a utility, like a right? Because can you really get by in our society without it?
That's an interesting question to pose as a right. I'm going to say no as a right, but I'm going to say it's a key factor in current and future. And I'm going to say it's not a right because honestly, while my life is easier with the internet, I can breathe.
Yeah.
Right. I can cook without the internet. I probably can't get medical care without the internet.
I don't know how you're going to schedule any appointments or anything because no one answers the phone.
Exactly. Because I don't want to call. I don't like being on hold. So I'm going to decide now that your access to the internet is economic opportunity. It like books, is access to different perspectives.
Yep.
Now, I still read the newspaper. You know why I read the newspaper? Is because I will scan over articles and possibly read something I wouldn't ordinarily read if I left it up to the AI-driven read these headlines.
Just the algorithm. Yeah.
Exactly. So I just want to
not be stuck in a bubble.
Precisely. No. Exactly. And get in my rut. Yep. See, we're right again. Yep. See, we're right again. No. How about another perspective on that issue? And do that. So I'm going to say it's not a right, but I think it's an important element of economic viability for an individual and for a community.
I have a couple of questions that are going to be totally unrelated to each other, but since I have you, I have to. I'm as I'm demonstrating, big fan of NASA, but I was once, I'll never forget, I was actually at a fire department and there were a bunch of dudes sitting around, as we do. And something about the James Webb Space Telescope came up, and like the cost of it came up, and there was a big uproar in the station where I'm like, that's awesome. Everyone else was like, why are we spending money on that? That's a waste of money. Why are we spending up there when we should be down here? I wonder what someone in your role at NASA would say to that.
Well, I get asked that question a lot. Why spend on NASA? Because what NASA does is they explore areas, they ask questions that haven't been asked before, or they've been asked before, but they put resources behind the answer. So let's take astronauts. It is hot in those suits. We've all seen them, right? Well, in trying to work at the comfort and safety of the astronauts, this field of cooling suits and heating suits starts. We put out, hey, give us your best product on whatever. So inventors, curious people just come back and do these things. That invention, there's one in particular, was not selected by NASA, this one particular company. But that technology is used in developing nations for childbirth. Childbirth, even in the United States, is still a big risky proposition.
Yeah.
Well, being able to cool a child born during distress or a mother birthing in distress, cooling them increases their chance of survival. So you see space tech in our everyday lives.
You just don't see it as space tech.
You don't see it as space tech because it's your product that you're buying. Several of the elements of a phone, a mobile phone, are from technology cameras that are developed for NASA to take pictures of space. But then you say to yourself, why space? What do we want to know? Well, we should know more about our universe. We contextually, we're not just Earth. It feels like we're just Earth, and we feel like we're just, the
so
county.
Hard to not lose sight of that some days.
Right.
Your life is just right in front of you.
Precisely. And it's chewing on you half the time. You're like, come on, leave me alone. So we're part of something bigger. So when we understand our universe and we understand what's going on with the rock that we live on, then we may understand humanity better. And we may discover things that could be used in medicine. Some of the research that goes on the International Space Station. Here's an everyday product. And you might say, oh, this is not so life-saving. Well, I think it is, as the person, I do laundry. So studying liquids in space is fabulous because the liquid itself behaves differently. If you've not seen it, go use your internet browser, right? And just look for liquids in space, and you're going to see International Space Station. You're going to see an astronaut smiling and little orange juice water globule going everywhere, right? Well, when you get to study liquids in space, you understand the properties, the physics properties associated with that liquid. Procter & Gamble did that. Years ago, they did this. Tide now uses less water and less plastic in its product because of studying in a zero gravity environment on the International Space Station the behaviors of liquids.
Which of course has an environmental impact down here.
Correct. And there's no loss. In fact, there's actually been gain, but not related to this experiment. There's been no loss of efficacy of the detergent.
Was the pun intended?
Yeah.
Gain?
I know. Yes. I was like, whoops, I did that. I'm product placement here. No one's paying for this. But so that's an everyday life thing. Our mobile phones have technology from space. Our homes, our microwaves, all of these things are space tech. They were really curious people trying to design things for space. And there's a whole organized agenda associated with space tech, right? And you can find that on NASA's website. And there's technology readiness, TRL levels, and where can those go? And NASA also supports businesses who develop things that they don't end up using, helping and guiding them, but not over guiding them because it is public money on getting to a product to market that could benefit someone. There's a website, I think it's home something or other, anyway, that shows you a home and you can go around and look at the different parts of your home that's brought to you by space tech. I'm going to talk about LiDAR. Bridges. Bridges used to have to be inspected, take a little chunk out of it. From an engineering perspective, and I'm no engineer, I think taking a big chunk out of something probably affects or could affect over the long haul, the bridge. LiDAR. Now, we don't need to take a big chunk out of the bridge, right? We can, tricorder it, Star Trek, right? You can just do this thing, scan it, and you'll learn about the bridge. So there's technology and that's out there. And there's another publication out there that NASA puts out every year about space technology in health, everyday space technology or technology in everyday life, science advancements, materials advancements that we've had, for expeditions and things like that. A lot of that was developed, in pursuit of space and the ability to nanotechnology associated with some elements of nanotechnology. I'm not saying nanotechnology, again, were discoveries for materials associated with space. And so the whole space tech portfolio that NASA has is really about benefiting humanity no matter where you are. We don't hold it back in the United States. It can be turned in to profit and market, which drives the United States. So your taxpayers go to benefit humanity. And honestly, I believe what my former boss said. It's both everything spent on NASA benefits humanity, whether it's education, whether it's inspiring people to dream big and giving them access to things that they might not have access to, books, internet, right? And then the technology that we develop where we don't end up using, well, actually, even when we use it, it's a commercial use. We created NASA, the Commercial Crew Program, SpaceX, launching back and forth that payload. That's from NASA. We learn so much more that benefits society. And I get it. You say billions. But the amount of money spent on NASA barely shows on the United States federal government budget chart.
Yeah.
And when you can inspire young people and older people or any people to dream big and solve problems in their community, then every single penny we spend at NASA is worth it.
Yeah, I think I can't add anything to that. Nailed it. My last question, my always final question on our podcast. Mm-hmm. You already kind of gave a really optimistic note, but we often talk about cybersecurity and we're talking about geopolitics and conflict and whatnot. So sometimes it can trend toward pessimism, right? Because there's bad going on and there's bad actors and there's scary things happening and whatnot. It's easy to get pessimistic and cynical. I'm curious what personally keeps you optimistic.
Honestly, I think humanity is better off now than we were before. I told you I'm reading these books, but I'll speak from a female perspective. I couldn't own land. I couldn't vote. It took 70 years for women to get the vote in the United States. No blood was shed over that. We were healthier, putting COVID aside. We're healthier. We know more about the human body. We know more about the brain. There's lots that we don't know. We as humans, we struggle, I think, with friction and people that are different than us, but they're not really different. than us because we don't sit down and get to know them. And I think one of the hardest parts about society now, and a little bit of the bandwagon about social media, is that we forget that we need human connections. And if we go out every day and try to make a human connection, just a smile, like pick up your groceries, gas person, give them a little wave, whatever it is, make that connection, because you don't know the difference that it's going to make for somebody. So I keep hope, because humans are pretty amazing. Oh, they're pretty horrible too. But society in general, as a female, I find that it's a lot better. And I hope it continues to grow and be better for all the generations behind me.
I love that. Yeah. Renee, it's been an absolute pleasure. I feel like we could go for hours and hours and hours.
I know. But, yes, thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this. Yeah. It
was fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's fun.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Watchers. For more great content, be sure to like, subscribe, and check out our channel. We'll see you on the next one.